300 Apache warriors. They stood silent in the morning mist, war paint streaked red and black across their faces, feathers trembling in the cold breeze, rifles and bows gleaming in the early light. Comment 1 if you want to pick up a rifle and fight like in the previous story. But if you're curious, then hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will turn everything you thought you knew upside down. Their ponies shifted beneath them, snorting steam into the desert air, hooves digging into the earth like they knew what was coming. The line stretched from one end of Painted Ridge to the other, a living wall of vengeance. And every last one of them was staring at a single wooden house on the flat below, Elias McGraw's house. From behind a cracked shutter, Elias watched them. He didn't blink, didn't breathe much either, just let his eyes move slowly across the ridge, counting faces, counting seconds. His hand rested on the butt of the Winchester leaning by the wall. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint rhythm of hoofbeats and a sound he hadn't heard in years: morning drums. 12 hours ago, Elias had been no one, just another bitter rancher with a busted leg and too many bad memories. He'd been feeding his stock, watching the sun dip over Eagles Canyon, when the shots came. Not clean, not precise, desperate, like somebody running out of time. Smart men would have ignored it, locked their doors, pulled the shades, and waited for trouble to pass. But Elias had never been good at playing it smart. Now he stood in the crosshairs of a people ready to burn his ranch to ash. And yet, somewhere in the back of his mind, a question rose up like smoke from an old fire. Would he still have made the same choice if he'd known it would come to this? 12 hours earlier, there were no war drums, no riders, no death in the wind, just the lowing of cattle and the creak of an old windmill turning above Elias McGraw's pasture. The sun was melting into the western edge of the canyon, casting gold light across the scrub and the sand. Elias stood near the fence line, leaning heavy on his cane, watching dust swirl around his boots. His ranch was small, 20 head of cattle, a few chickens, and silence stretching for miles. That suited him fine. He didn't much care for company since the war, not after what it took from him: his leg, his men, his faith. He'd just finished mending the chicken coop when he heard it. Gunshots, distant but sharp, coming from the direction of Eagles Canyon. 3, maybe 4. Not a firefight, not target practice, scattered, erratic, desperate. He froze. Most folks in these parts would have gone inside, bolted the door, poured a drink, and let the desert sort things out. Smart folks. But Elias had heard that kind of shooting before. The kind that doesn't come from raiders or bounty hunters. The kind that comes from a man trying to stay alive. And that was the kind that still made his hands twitch toward the rifle. He didn't ask why, didn't make a plan, just saddled his horse, grabbed his Winchester, and rode into the dusk, chasing trouble like it owed him something. What he found in the canyon was a broken body face down in the dirt, buckskin stained deep crimson, blood pooling into the sand. The boy, no more than 22, had been hit 3 times. A beaded necklace lay twisted near his hand. His chest barely moved. Apache. Important, too, judging by the ceremonial work on his shirt. Elias's grip tightened on his rifle. Everything in him said, turn around, leave the kid to die, let the desert finish what bullets started. God knows Apache war parties had taken enough from this land, and from Elias himself. But then the boy's eyes fluttered open. Not fear, not hatred, just recognition. And with a voice barely more than breath, he said one word: please. For a long moment, Elias didn't move. He stood over the dying Apache, boots planted in blood-stained dust, rifle clenched tight, finger ghosting the trigger. The wind stirred, brushing grit across the boy's face, and still Elias said nothing, thought nothing, just stared. This was the kind of moment that carved lines in a man's soul. The Apache had raided ranches all summer, burned homes, slaughtered families. Elias had seen the smoke from his own ridge. Some said the Morrison boy had watched his mother die screaming. Others claimed a war party had strung up a preacher outside Tombstone. There was no shortage of blood between whites and Apache, no shortage of reasons to walk away. Hell, most men in Elias's boots would have put another bullet in the kid just to be sure. But as he looked down into those half-lidded eyes, eyes that didn't accuse, didn't beg, just held some quiet knowing, something cracked in Elias's chest, something old and buried. He didn't speak, didn't curse, just dropped to one knee beside the boy. The wounds were bad, one in the shoulder, one through the ribs, another in the thigh. But the kid was still breathing somehow, still bleeding hard. Elias tore a strip from the boy's shirt, pressed down on the worst wound, and muttered, "Damn fool," though he wasn't sure who he meant. The sun was almost gone, night was coming fast, and riding back with a wounded Apache in these hills, that was suicide. But Elias had made his choice. He slung the rifle across his back, bent low, and lifted the young man onto his horse. The kid groaned, but didn't fight it, couldn't. Elias made a difficult choice for a stranger. What would you have done in his place? Share your thoughts below. The ride home would be a long mile of shadows and bad omens. Every rock, every whisper in the brush felt like a war party waiting to end him. But Elias didn't stop, not once. The ride back felt like an eternity. Elias kept low in the saddle, one hand steadying the unconscious Apache, the other never straying far from the butt of his revolver. His eyes scanned the ridgelines. The rocks seemed to breathe. The dark whispered. But no arrows came, no whoops of war, just silence. When he reached the ranch, Elias didn't hesitate. He kicked open the cabin door, laid the boy on his own bed, and went to work. The bullets had missed anything vital, but just barely. Blood loss was the real threat. Elias worked by lamplight, cutting away the buckskin shirt, cleaning the wounds with whiskey and boiled water. His hands were steady, too steady for a man who hadn't touched another soul in weeks. As he reached for clean bandages, something around the boy's neck caught his eye. A leather pouch, dark with sweat and dirt. Curious, Elias opened it. Inside was a folded, cracked photograph, black and white, faded at the edges. But what it showed stopped Elias cold. A white woman, her arm resting gently on the shoulder of a young Apache boy, no more than 8, both smiling, caught in some forgotten summer light. The woman's face, it was familiar, too familiar. "Margaret," he whispered. Elias sank into the chair beside the bed, the photo trembling in his hands. Margaret Whitestone, the missionary's daughter. She'd gone to teach at the reservation school. Kind, stubborn, gentle in a way this land didn't often allow. Elias had seen her once, years ago, outside a church tent near Dry Mesa. And now here she was, frozen in time, with an Apache child at her side. The same Apache child now bleeding in his bed. Elias stared at the boy's face, the shape of his jaw, the way his mouth rested. Recognition hit like a gut punch. This wasn't just some wounded raider. This was someone caught between two worlds, like Elias himself once had been. Dawn came with no warning, just a pale orange light peeling over the hills, and the low, dry breath of the desert wind curling through the window slats. Elias stood at the basin, bloodied rags piled at his feet, washing his hands in silence. The boy, Chayton, still breathed, shallow, uneven, but alive. Elias poured more water into the pan, but the sound that followed froze him cold. Drums. Faint at first, then clearer, a steady rhythm rising from the direction of the highlands. 3 short beats, 4 long. Then silence. He dropped the basin. The sound wasn't foreign. He'd heard it once along the Colorado, back when he wore blue and marched under Hartwell's banner. It wasn't a war call, not a hunting beat. It was a death song. Someone important had gone missing. Elias turned to look at the boy. He hadn't stirred in hours. But now, as if hearing the drums himself, Chayton's eyes fluttered open. Dry, distant, but aware. Elias raised the cup. Drink, slowly. The boy took a few sips, then coughed. His lips moved in Apache, then stammered in broken English. "My father looks for me." Elias leaned in. "Who's your father?" The answer came soft, but heavy as thunder. "Chief Ten Crow, of the White Mountain Band. I am Chayton Greyhawk." He tried to sit up, wincing, blood blooming through the bandage on his ribs. "I was riding to meet Colonel Hartwell. Peace talk, treaty." Elias felt the floor vanish beneath his boots. A peace envoy. He had just saved a peace envoy, which meant, if the Apache thought the whites had murdered the chief's son on the eve of a treaty, it wouldn't be a war. It would be an extermination. Chayton is a peace envoy caught in a deadly trap. What do you think is truly driving all these forces against them? Let's discuss. The sound of drums grew louder, pulsing through the earth, echoing off the canyon walls. Elias moved to the window and peered through a narrow crack in the wooden shutter. What he saw made his gut twist. Riders, at least 50, sweeping in a perfect arc across the valley. Feathers in their hair, rifles slung across shoulders, sunlight dancing on polished tomahawk blades. They were forming a crescent around the ranch, north to south, tight, organized. He didn't need binoculars to know who led them. Even at this distance, the figure atop the painted Mustang was unmistakable. Tall, straight-backed, face streaked in red and coal black, a ceremonial rifle raised high like a banner of judgment. Chief Ten Crow. Beside him, warriors were checking their weapons, making ready. Behind Elias, Chayton stirred again. He tried to sit up, groaned, and fell back. "I must go. To them," he rasped. "Tell them I live." "You can't even stand," Elias snapped. "You take 2 steps off this porch, you'll bleed to death in the dirt." Chayton turned his head, eyes fixed and steady. "Then, you take me." Elias let out a dry laugh, no humor in it. "You want me to ride into a war party carrying a wounded Apache? They'll fill us both with arrows before we can wave a hand." "Maybe," Chayton said. "Or maybe they listen." Elias didn't answer. He moved to the back window instead and stopped cold. Another dust trail, fast-moving, closing in from the direction of town. A posse. He recognized the lead rider by the shape of his hat and the fury in his seat. Sheriff Amos Tradger. 20 armed men behind him. And they weren't coming to negotiate. Elias's mouth went dry. From the front, Apache war party. From the rear, townsfolk with itchy fingers. And in between, 1 ranch, 2 men, 1 truth, and a powder keg of misunderstanding ready to blow. They were boxed in. Elias checked his rifle, then checked it again, though the rounds hadn't changed. Chayton leaned against the wall, pale, sweat glistening on his brow, blood slowly seeping through fresh wrappings. "They're coming from both sides," Elias muttered. "Your people think I called for help. Tradger and his boys think I'm about to be slaughtered." Chayton nodded grimly. Both sides ready for war. Then came a sound that didn't belong to either. Crack! A rifle shot rang out across the desert, sharp, distant. Not from the Apache, not from the town. Both men froze. Chayton turned toward the canyon ridge. Wait, that shot, it not come from my people. Elias grabbed his field glasses and swept the ridge line. There, behind a boulder, just a flash of color, barely visible through the haze. Blue, cavalry blue. Elias's heart skipped. He adjusted focus. More movement. Rifles tucked behind rocks. Uniformed silhouettes. Hidden soldiers. Son of a bitch, he breathed. That's a patrol. Hartwell must have sent them ahead to escort the peace envoy. Another shot cracked from the rocks, this time aimed lower. Dust kicked up near the Apache line. They were firing at everyone. They think they're breaking up an Apache ambush, Elias realized. They don't know we're all circling the same lie. Outside, Chief 10 Crow raised his arm. The Apache warriors stirred. On the opposite side, Traeger's posse picked up speed. The soldiers in the rocks, nervous, confused, shooting blind. Chayton gritted his teeth. You have to stop this. Elias stared at him. How? Chayton's voice came soft but clear. You get to my father, or this desert drinks all our blood. The next gunshot changed everything. It cracked across the desert like a lightning bolt, sharp, clean, final. And it came from somewhere between the Apache line and Traeger's posse. A single, nervous finger. One man, too scared to wait. That was all it took. From the ridge, Chief 10 Crow's warriors surged forward with a war cry that rolled across the plain like thunder. Horses reared, bows lifted, rifles fired. From behind the ranch, Traeger's men screamed curses and spurred their mounts, galloping into the fray like men already halfway to hell. And from the rocks, the hidden cavalry opened fire in all directions, the sun catching their muzzles as they lit up the canyon with steel and flame. Chaos. Elias watched through the glass as bodies began to fall. On the left, Traeger's youngest deputy, barely a man, took an arrow to the shoulder and tumbled from his horse, screaming. On the right, an Apache warrior pitched forward, blood arcing from his chest, shot by a bullet meant for someone else. In the middle, the ranch trembled with the roar of hoofbeats and gunfire. "This is madness," Elias whispered. But even as he said it, he was moving, grabbing his hat, loading his rifle, pulling Chayton upright. "You'll be killed," Chayton rasped. "Maybe," Elias said, "but if I don't try, we're all dead anyway." He handed the photograph, the one from the pouch, to Chayton. "If something happens to me, you make sure your father sees this. You tell him a white man believed your mother was right." Chayton's grip was weak but steady. "Then we go together," he said, eyes burning. Elias stared at him. The kid couldn't even stand without help. But he was right. Only one thing might stop this now. A son standing before his father. They didn't have time to think. Elias threw open the cabin door, his arm locked under Chayton's, half carrying him toward the barn. Gunfire cracked from every direction, sharp bursts, war cries, screams, but he didn't flinch. "Come on, boy," he growled through gritted teeth. "If we're gonna die, let's die doing something right." They stumbled into the open, no cover but the rising dust and the chaos behind them. A bullet sliced past Elias's ear, close enough to feel the heat of it. "They're shooting at us," Chayton gasped, barely able to keep his feet. "Good," Elias spat, dragging him toward the base of the water tower. "Maybe that'll get their damn attention." Another shot struck the ground inches from Chayton's boots. Two more followed. But then, nothing. Not silence, a pause. The kind of moment that doesn't belong on battlefields. One by one, rifles lowered. Eyes turned. Three factions, all ready to kill, were now watching something they couldn't explain. A wounded Apache and a limping white rancher walking together into the fire. They reached the base of the water tower. Chayton looked up. The ladder stretched 30 feet into the sky. "Can you climb?" Elias asked, breath ragged. "Have to," Chayton said. He started up, one hand at a time. His foot slipped once. Blood dripped from his ribs. Elias followed close behind, ready to catch him. Halfway up, Chayton sagged. Elias pressed against him, bracing both of them with one arm. "I've got you, son," he whispered. "Why?" Chayton asked, voice barely a breath. "Why risk everything for your enemy?" Elias didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Maybe you're not my enemy. Maybe your mother was right. Or maybe I'm just too damn stubborn to watch good men die for nothing." They climbed higher, into the sun, into the crosshairs of every rifle on the field. Elias and Chayton are risking everything to stand together. Do you believe one person's courage can change the tide of war? Tell us what you think. They reached the top. Elias hauled himself onto the platform, then turned and pulled Chayton the rest of the way. The young Apache collapsed beside him, chest heaving, face pale, but his eyes were locked on the battlefield. From up here, they could see it all. To the east, Chief 10 Crow's war party stood poised on the ridge, bows drawn, rifles raised, faces painted for death. To the west, Sheriff Tragger's posse had taken cover behind Elias's cattle pens, watching, waiting, bloodied and tense. And from the rocks, the cavalry patrol, still pinned, still firing sporadically into the dust and smoke. In the middle, a silence hung like threadbare cloth over a powder keg. Chayton pulled the photograph from his shirt and held it up, letting the sun catch the worn image. His mother, Margaret Whitestone, and a boy half his age, both smiling in that long-lost summer. Then, with a voice that seemed too strong for a man that close to dying, he shouted, "Father!" The word rang across the desert, both in Apache and again in broken English. "I live! I am safe!" Down below, Chief 10 Crow jolted in his saddle. His painted face twisted, not in rage, but something deeper. Grief, relief, confusion, hope. He rode forward, straining to see. Elias stepped forward beside Chayton and lifted his arms, slow and deliberate, the photograph in plain sight. From across the plain, Colonel Hartwell had arrived with fresh cavalry reinforcements. He now sat astride a tall bay horse, field glasses trained directly on the water tower. His jaw was tight, his hand hovered near his saber. Elias saw it, the hesitation. He knew that look, the one officers made when they weren't sure if they were about to give an order or start a war. So he shouted, "This man is Chief 10 Crow's son! He came for peace!" The entire desert held its breath. Colonel Silas Hartwell reined in his horse halfway between his column and the Apache line. Even from this distance, Elias could see the white-knuckled grip on the colonel's reins, the way his eyes narrowed behind the field glasses. "Colonel Hartwell," Elias shouted again, louder this time. "The boy you see bleeding up here, he's your envoy. He was ambushed before he could reach you. I found him, and I saved him." Hartwell hesitated, lowered his glasses. His horse danced under him, sensing its rider's tension. Behind him, cavalrymen fanned out, waiting for a signal. Elias continued, "You attack now, and you start a war based on a lie." A long moment passed. Then Chayton stepped forward, still holding the photograph high. "My father sent me," he called, "to speak peace. I bleed now, not from soldiers, not from his hand," he pointed weakly toward Hartwell, "but from those who want war." Below, Chief 10 Crow dismounted. He walked to the center of the field alone, no weapon in hand, his war paint cracked by sweat and sun. He looked up at the tower, at the sun he thought lost, and his knees gave slightly beneath him. He raised a hand, spoke in Apache. Chayton nodded. His voice cracked but held. "He says he came for vengeance, but finds his son alive, and finds not all white men are devils." Colonel Hartwell took a breath, long and slow, then gave a single nod. He turned to his men and dropped his hand. Swords were sheathed, rifles lowered. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Then Sheriff Trager stepped out from behind the ranch house, rifle raised, voice dripping with fury. "Don't you move, red devil," he shouted. "This is a trick." Just like that, the air snapped again. Sheriff Amos Trager's voice split the desert like a whip crack. "You think we're fools?" he shouted, his rifle aimed square at Chief Tencrow's heart. "That Apache butcher killed the Morrison family last month. You're all falling for a trick." The stillness shattered. Apache warriors tensed, hands tightening around rifle stocks and bowstrings. The cavalry shifted in their saddles, glancing to their colonel for orders. The townsfolk behind the ranch house raised their guns again. Elias felt it, the shift, that razor-thin balance, tipping back toward blood. On the tower beside him, Chayton swayed, his face pale, bandages soaked through. But when he saw his father freeze mid-step, hands lowering, eyes darkening with rage, he gathered what strength he had left and called out again. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through everything. "Father." Tencrow turned his head. "If blood spills now, Mother Spirit will never forgive us." The chief flinched as if struck. Chayton steadied himself on the railing. "She believed peace was possible. I still do." Tencrow looked up at the tower, then back at Trager. His hand had drifted to his tomahawk, but now he pulled it from his belt and dropped it to the dust. Gasps rippled through the Apache line. The old chief took 3 steps forward, slow and deliberate, until he stood 10 paces from Trager. "I know Morrison," he said, voice rough but controlled. "The warrior who did that thing, he broke my law, disobeyed my word. I bring you his name and his justice. But I will not burn the world for one man's hatred." Trager's aim faltered. Behind him, Colonel Hartwell dismounted and stepped between the 2 men. "Sheriff," he said calmly, "lower your weapon." Trager hesitated. Then, slowly, he did. For the second time that morning, the killing stopped inches from the edge. Peace hung in the air like a trembling note on a fiddle string, beautiful, fragile, and one gust away from snapping. Chief Tencrow stepped back beside Colonel Hartwell. Chayton leaned against the tower railing, body drained, but his eyes still locked on his father. Elias let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Then Chayton whispered, barely audible, "Look." Elias followed his gaze. Eastward, past the ridge, past the smoke rising from the rocks. Another dust cloud. Another war party. Fast, hard riding, Apache. But not Tencrow's warriors. The paint was different, black and yellow. The war calls they loosed into the air were higher, sharper. Chayton's face drained of color. "Mescalero," he breathed. "Allies. They come because they heard drums, saw smoke. They think the war has begun." Elias raised his field glasses. Over 100 riders, closing fast. No scouts, no flanks, just a full-on charge toward the ranch and everyone around it. Hartwell saw them too. He spun to his second-in-command. "Form ranks." Tencrow shouted something in Apache and vaulted onto his horse. He spurred forward, trying to intercept the mescalero, shouting warnings. But they were too far, too fast, too ready for war. Trager scrambled back toward the house. "We need to dig in," he shouted. "Everyone to cover."
Elias stared at the oncoming riders. No one could stop them. No voice could reach them in time.
Not unless. He turned to Chayton, unconscious now, body slumped, the photograph still clutched in his hand. Elias swallowed hard, then looked to the field. Chief Ten Crow was alone, galloping toward brothers who didn't yet know peace had nearly been made. And Colonel Hartwell, already pulling his saber again. Elias bounded down the water tower ladder with Chayton limp in his arms. The boy's head lolled against his shoulder, breath shallow but steady. The desert spun with chaos, warriors shouting, cavalry scrambling, townsfolk scattering for cover. When he reached the ground, Chief Ten Crow was already galloping back toward the tower, his face grim. "Cannot stop them," he said, his voice rough from shouting. "Too far, too fast." "Maybe you can't," Elias said, laying Chayton gently in the shade of the tower. "But maybe someone else can." Colonel Hartwell arrived a heartbeat later, his mount slick with sweat. "What the hell are you proposing, Whitmore?" Elias looked him square in the eye. "A cavalry charge." Hartwell blinked. "Excuse me?" "Not to fight, to intercept. You and Ten Crow ride together, side by side. If the Mescaleros see Apache and army charging together, maybe they'll stop long enough to listen." Tradger, dust-covered and furious, burst forward from behind the ranch house. "That's suicide! You ride into them like that, they'll cut you down!" Hartwell turned to Ten Crow. The old chief stared down at his son, still unconscious, then at Elias. "This your plan?" Elias nodded. "Only one we've got." Ten Crow looked back at the horizon, where thunder rose from hooves and painted feathers filled the sky. Then he mounted his horse again. "For my son," he said, "and for hers." Colonel Hartwell dismounted and offered a hand. They shook once, firm, silent, then mounted side by side. Two old enemies, now riding into the storm, not to end lives, but to stop them from being lost. Colonel Silas Hartwell, in his polished blue uniform, saber lowered but ready, dust coating his boots. Chief Ten Crow beside him, face streaked with ash, war feathers trailing behind, his rifle slung high but untouched. One steel horse, one painted Mustang. They did not shout, they did not wave, they just rode, into a storm of Mescalero war cries. From the ridge, the approaching Apache force was less than 2 minutes out, arrows notched, rifles raised, eyes wild with fire. Their leaders had seen only smoke, drums, gunfire, and assumed betrayal. And now? Now they saw the unthinkable. A U.S. cavalry officer and an Apache war chief riding side by side into their line. It didn't compute. Riders slowed, voices faltered. What madness was this? In the ranch below, Elias watched from beside Chayton's still form. The boy hadn't moved, but the photograph remained clenched in his fingers, creased now, edges curled. Come on, Elias thought, let them see the truth. Around him, Traeger's men clutched their rifles tighter. The cavalry held the line, but no one moved. All eyes were on the two riders in the dust. And then, like a ripple through water, the Mescalero line began to slow. No charge, no arrows, just confusion, questions. And for the first time since dawn, the wind carried no war drums. Only hoofbeats and the rising chance that peace might still outrun the bullets. Elias could barely breathe. He stood in the dust beside the water tower, watching the Mescalero line shift, like a coiled serpent, unsure whether to strike or recoil. Hundreds of riders now moved slower, hesitating, circling, forming a ragged crescent around the two figures riding directly toward them. Chief Ten Crow raised one hand in an ancient Apache gesture, palm open, weaponless. Colonel Hartwell did the same. They kept riding, not fast, but steady, as if the very rhythm of their horses' hooves was meant to calm the storm. No sudden moves, no shouts, just presence. Chayton stirred. His lips parted, and in a hoarse breath he whispered, "They're watching." Elias knelt beside him. "Yeah, they are." Chayton tried to sit up but winced, pain flooding his face. Still he kept his gaze fixed on the horizon. "If they don't stop." "I know." A low, guttural chant began among the mescalero, not a war cry, something older, a song of recognition, of confusion, of mourning interrupted. One rider moved ahead of the rest, a war leader, broad-shouldered, face painted bone white. His bow remained lowered, but his voice carried. He shouted something in Apache. 10 Crow answered in kind. They spoke across 50 yards of sun-baked earth, language sharp, tense, ancient. Elias didn't understand the words, but he understood the stakes. Every syllable carried the weight of generations, of vengeance and betrayal, of treaties broken and graves dug too shallow. And yet, through the shimmering heat, the war leader's bow never lifted. Not yet. Then, as if answering an unspoken prayer, he signaled with 2 fingers. The mescalero warriors halted. Dust swirled around their hooves. No charge came, just silence. And in that silence, a chance. From the ground, Elias watched as Chief 10 Crow and Colonel Hartwell slowed their mounts, halting just shy of the mescalero front line. The war leader stepped forward, his eyes sharp beneath a painted brow, scanning both men. There was no welcome, only scrutiny. 10 Crow spoke first, voice low but firm, and gestured back toward the ranch, toward the water tower, toward his son. The mescalero glanced in that direction. Chayton still lay beneath the tower's shade, one hand on his wound, the other clutching the photograph, his mother's face still visible, even from a distance. The war leader tilted his head. He said something short, clipped. 10 Crow answered with a longer phrase, measured, careful. Then he held out both hands, empty, palms up. A gesture of offering. Colonel Hartwell remained quiet, letting the old chief speak. Elias leaned forward, straining to catch the meaning in tone and stance. The mescalero looked to Hartwell now, studying his uniform, his eyes. The colonel met the gaze without blinking. Then, in a move that sent murmurs rippling through both cavalry and Apache lines, Hartwell removed his saber. He dismounted, drove the blade tip first into the dirt. A gesture older than the war, older than this country, a soldier's vow of truce. The mescalero's expression didn't soften, but his hand drifted from his bow. Another rider approached him, an elder, hair streaked with white, a necklace of small bones across his chest. They spoke quickly. Finally, the war leader turned and nodded, once. Chief 10 Crow exhaled. Colonel Hartwell looked back toward Elias, then raised a hand, signaling his men. Not to charge, but to stand down. And across the field, rifles began to lower. The tide had shifted, but no one dared to breathe easy yet. Because peace on this land didn't live in treaties. It lived in every choice still to come. Back at the ranch, the mood was shifting. The gunfire had stopped, but no one moved like it had. The air still crackled with tension, like dry brush just waiting for a match. Traeger's men watched the distant riders with suspicion carved deep into their faces. The cavalry stood ready, eyes darting between their colonel and the Apache lines. But Elias didn't look at any of them. He looked at Chayton. The boy was breathing, barely. His head lolled to the side, but his grip on the photograph hadn't loosened. "You held them off," Elias whispered, "just long enough." Footsteps approached from behind.
Sheriff Traeger. His rifle was lowered now, but his jaw was clenched, eyes darting toward the Apache every few seconds. "You think that's the end of it?" he asked quietly. Elias didn't answer. Traeger went on, voice tight. "They show up with painted faces and bows drawn, and we're supposed to shake hands and break bread?" Elias turned to him, slow.
"They showed up because they thought we'd killed their son," Traeger scowled. "They thought wrong." "No," Elias said. "They thought exactly what we would have thought if it had been one of ours lying face down in their canyon." He stood, every movement stiff with pain and anger of his own. "We don't have to trust them, not yet, but we damn well better listen." Traeger looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He just looked out across the desert, toward the place where Chief Ten Crow and Colonel Hartwell stood among Mescalero warriors, men who just minutes ago had been charging toward bloodshed. Now, they were listening, talking, maybe even understanding. The wind picked up again, scattering dust across the yard. Elias looked down at Chayton, then toward the horizon. Peace hadn't been won. It had been borrowed. And if they weren't careful, it'd vanish before sundown. The heat was rising. By mid-morning, the battlefield no longer smelled of powder or fear, but of sweat, dust, and blood slowly drying beneath the sun. No one fired, no one shouted, but no one smiled either. Elias poured a little water into a tin cup and knelt beside Chayton, lifting his head gently. The boy's eyes fluttered open, clouded with exhaustion. But he drank. "You held the line," Elias said, "long enough for them to see you." Chayton's lips barely moved. "Father?" "Still standing," Elias said, "riding beside your enemy." That got a faint twitch of a smile. Chayton looked past Elias now, toward the figures in the distance. His eyes locked on Ten Crow, still mounted, still speaking calmly among the Mescalero leaders. Colonel Hartwell stood beside him, arms crossed, listening. Then Chayton's hand reached for Elias's sleeve. "You must tell them about the photograph." Elias held it up, now more dirt-stained than not. "Your father saw it. He knew. He knew it was her." Chayton closed his eyes. "Then there's hope." Elias nodded slowly. "Yeah, there is, but it's fragile." Behind them, footsteps again. Traeger. He didn't speak this time, just crouched beside the boy. His hands rested on his knees. "Never thought I'd say it," the sheriff muttered, "but that old chief dropped his blade when he could have thrown it. Maybe that means something." Chayton turned his head toward him, weak but firm. "He does not forget, but he forgives." Traeger met his gaze, and then, for the first time, looked away first. Not in shame, in thought, maybe something deeper, something beginning. By midday, the battlefield had become something else entirely, not a place of war, a place of decision. The Mescalero warriors no longer stood in formation. Some had dismounted, wiping dust from their faces, speaking in low tones. Others tended to their horses, silent but watchful. Chief Ten Crow returned slowly to the ranch, leading his horse rather than riding it. The act wasn't weakness, it was intent. Colonel Hartwell walked beside him. They didn't speak much, they didn't need to. When they reached the yard, Elias stepped forward to meet them. Chayton stirred behind him, watching with heavy eyes from the shade. Ten Crow's gaze found his son. Their eyes met. No words passed, but something moved between them. Old grief, new understanding. A bridge neither war nor silence could break. Then the old chief turned to Elias. "You risked all," he said, voice low, rasped by dust and age. "For a boy not your own, for a people not your blood." Elias nodded. Didn't feel like a choice. Ten Crow looked down at the photograph Elias still held. He reached out and gently took it, running his fingers over the face of the woman he'd once loved. "My son lives because of you," he said, "so this land lives too." He looked to his warriors, then back to Hartwell. "Let us speak peace." Hartwell nodded. "We speak peace," he said, "or we speak over graves." No fanfare, no ink yet signed, but in that quiet corner of Arizona territory, a war just ended. Not with gunpowder, but with mercy. The sun rode high over the ranch now, burning away what was left of the morning haze. What remained was clearer than smoke. People, wounded, breathing, still alive. Colonel Hartwell's men emerged from the rocks one by one, dust-streaked, shaken, but intact. The patrol that had unknowingly lit the match was finally pulled back into the fold, some assisted by Mescalero warriors who offered canteens without words. On the opposite side, Traeger's men tended their wounded too. Even he didn't protest when an Apache medicine man approached the youngest deputy, arrow still lodged in his shoulder, and knelt beside him with herbs and flint. They exchanged no names, only nods. Elias watched from the porch, a tin cup in one hand, the other resting on Chayton's shoulder. The boy sat propped against a barrel, a blanket over his lap, color returning to his face. "They're talking," Elias said quietly. "Real talk, not treaty talk, human talk." Chayton gave a small smile. "That's how peace starts." Ten Crow and Hartwell stood at the edge of the corral now, marking something into the dirt with the butt of a staff and a saber. Drawing shapes Elias didn't recognize, but somehow understood. Lines of understanding, marks of promise. Traeger stood alone for a while, watching. Then, without a word, he walked over and laid his rifle on Elias's porch rail. "I reckon this land might finally be worth guarding," he muttered. Elias nodded, but didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward the photograph, now gently set on the inside windowsill beneath a small tin lantern. Margaret's smile still shone. And for the first time in years, it didn't hurt to see it. 3 days later, the ranch looked different. Not by much. The fences were still weather-worn, the well still groaned at sunrise. But there was something in the air now that hadn't been there before. Laughter. Apache children played near the creek that ran behind the barn, laughing, splashing water, their voices high and fearless. A few cavalrymen stood watch nearby, not with rifles, but with relaxed stances and amused expressions. Elias leaned on the porch rail, watching it all with a mug of black coffee cooling in his hand. Inside the cabin, Chayton was sitting upright now, dressed in clean clothes, his bandages tight and healing. He held a small slate board in one hand and was drawing a crude map for 2 curious white boys from Dry Mesa who'd come with their mother to trade flour for hides. "I teach them routes," he said to Elias when they asked. "Safe roads, places no one shoot." Elias just smiled. Out near the corral, Chief Ten Crow stood in silence beside Colonel Hartwell. They watched as a young Apache man and a cavalry scout worked together to build a small covered stall for what would soon be the shared trading post. It wasn't much, but it was something. "You think it'll hold?" Elias asked quietly. Hartwell didn't look away from the work. "No idea, but hell, McGraw, this time we've got people on both sides who want it to." Ten Crow nodded once. "Peace grows, like wild mesquite. You cut it, it comes back, stronger." Elias looked out across the desert. Same dust, same sun, but somehow softer now. Somehow. Later that evening, the light turned gold over the fields, and Elias sat with Chayton beneath the cottonwood near the barn. A breeze lifted the edge of Chayton's blanket, and somewhere off near the creek, someone was singing. Soft, low, a woman's voice in Apache. "I don't know that tune," Elias said. Chayton smiled faintly. "It's a lullaby. My mother sang it. She said, even hard land deserves soft songs." They sat in silence for a while. Then Chayton looked up, eyes steady. "They want me to speak.
Between the bands, between your colonel and my father. Elias nodded. Seems fitting. I'm not sure I know all the words, Chayton said.
You don't have to, Elias said. Just mean them. Chayton turned to him. And you? What now? Elias thought for a moment, then gestured to the porch, where the photograph now hung in a carved cedar frame. I think I'll stay here. Keep this land from falling backward. You'll need help, Chayton said. Elias looked at him. Already got it. They didn't say more, didn't need to. From the corral, 2 children, one Apache, one white, ran past, chasing a chicken that wanted no part of either. Dust kicked up, and still no one reached for a gun. That night, Elias didn't light the lantern. He sat on the porch in the dark, listening. Not for hoofbeats, not for war drums, just for the quiet. And for once, it stayed. The stars were out in full force, 1,000 lanterns scattered across the black. Somewhere in the trees, an owl called. Farther off, a baby cried, then was hushed by a woman's soft singing in a mix of English and Apache. Elias leaned back in his chair. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd felt safe leaving his rifle inside. Footsteps approached, not hurried, measured. It was Chief Ten Crow. He didn't speak right away, just stood beside the porch, eyes scanning the dark horizon. Our people were taught to watch the night, the old man said finally, to know what silence means. Elias nodded. Sometimes it means they're waiting. Ten Crow looked down, and sometimes it means they've stopped. They stood that way for a moment. 2 old men, 2 sides of a war that didn't quite happen. I buried my anger here, Ten Crow said softly, next to her spirit. Elias glanced at the photograph through the window. She deserved more, he said. She gave more, Ten Crow replied, even now. A gust of warm wind rolled over the porch, carrying with it the scent of mesquite smoke and stew from one of the nearby camps. The chief nodded once, then walked off into the darkness, no sound but the soft rhythm of his feet on the sand. And Elias?
He just sat back in the chair again and listened to a piece he'd never thought he'd live to hear. 3 weeks later, the treaty was signed. Not in Washington, not in some marble hall, but under the cottonwoods beside Elias McGraw's barn, with a rough-hewn table, 4 ink pens, and a dozen calloused hands. Colonel Hartwell, Chief Ten Crow, 2 Mescalero leaders, and a notary borrowed from Tombstone who hadn't quite believed it until he saw it with his own eyes. Chayton stood between them all, translator, witness, bridge. Elias watched it happen from a few paces back. Didn't speak, didn't need to, because sometimes the loudest thing a man can do is listen. Later that evening, the final copy was handed to Elias. He didn't sign it. He just rolled it up and handed it back. "This paper's not what holds peace," he said. "People do." Chayton nodded. "Then we'll hold it. Together." That night, fires were lit across the field. White families and Apache clans ate side by side. No speeches, no guards, just food, laughter, and the sound of children not knowing they were supposed to hate each other. And somewhere in that night, Elias wandered off, back to the water tower. He climbed it slow, his leg aching with every rung, and stood at the top, looking out over the land he once thought would bury him in bitterness. Now it breathed. And when the wind came, soft and low, it didn't carry fear or smoke. It carried a whisper, a voice he hadn't heard in years. And though there were no words, he knew what it said. They say out here in the territory, a man is judged by 2 things, what he stands for and what he won't walk away from. Elias McGraw never asked to be part of any treaty. He didn't seek peace talks. He didn't carry a banner or speak like politicians do. He just heard a gunshot in the canyon and rode toward it. That's all. But sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it takes one man to stop a bullet or to carry someone else's pain a little further than he ought to.
And when that happens, when a broken old soldier stands between three armies not with threats but with truth, the land remembers, the people remember, even the wind remembers. There's a kind of courage that doesn't shout, doesn't wear a badge, doesn't ride in with reinforcements. It just shows up and stays, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Elias never spoke much about what happened that day. Didn't need to. The land told the story for him. In the way the grass grew again near the creek, in the sound of children, white and Apache, chasing each other past the fence lines once marked by fear. In the way travelers spoke of a ranch out past Painted Ridge where enemies once laid down their guns, not because they ran out of bullets, but because a wounded boy held up a photograph and said, "Please." That's the kind of story that doesn't end. It settles, like dust on the boots of those who walk forward a little more carefully, and maybe a little more kindly. Because out here, when a man chooses mercy over revenge, truth over fear, well, sometimes that changes more than a war. Sometimes it changes the people who survive it. One man's courage can stop a war, but it takes two hearts to start peace. If that story meant something to you, there's more waiting down the trail. Hit that subscribe button and ride with us again next week. We've got another tale that'll test your pulse and maybe your soul. In the chaos of that desert standoff, guns raised, hearts hardened, it wasn't the weapons that changed history. It was one quiet decision. A wounded man on a battlefield and someone who chose to see him as more than an enemy. That's what makes this story matter. Because the world hasn't really changed that much. Sure, we're not on horseback anymore, but we still ride into our own battles every day. Arguments with people who think differently, judgments passed in seconds, grudges held like rifles. We build walls, draw lines, and sometimes forget that on the other side is someone just as human as us. Elias could have let the boy die. No one would have blamed him. But something in him refused to believe the worst about the boy or about himself. He chose to carry, not kill, to understand, not assume. And that's a choice every one of us still faces. Maybe not with bullets, but with words, with silence, with how we respond to those who've wronged us or simply don't look like us. Do we reach for the old story, fear, anger, distance? Or do we write a new one? Compassion, risk, connection. This isn't just a Western, it's a mirror, and in it we see our own test. Who are we when no one's watching? What do we stand for when it costs us something? That's why true Wild West stories still matter. Because under the dust and drama, they hold something rare, truth. The truth that it's easier to pull a trigger than it is to forgive. That it's braver to listen than to shout. That peace starts with people willing to take the first step, especially when the second step is uncertain. Elias didn't just save a life, he saved a future, because he chose the harder path. And if one man could do that in a time of war, what's stopping us today? So next time you face a moment of heat, on the street, at work, online, pause. Ask yourself, what would I have done standing on that porch looking out at 300 angry faces? Then make the kind of choice that builds bridges, not walls. That's the power of stories like this. That's why we tell them, not just to remember the West, but to remember who we could be. If this spoke to you, stick around, because the next story might not be about cowboys and warriors, but it might be the one that helps you fight the right battle in your own life.